Yes, so we have two important philosophers of science of the second half of the 20th century here with us today, Paul Hoyningen-Huene and Philip Kitcher. I don't think their work needs any introduction. An expert on Kuhn, the reception of Kuhn, and how we can use that work to understand science. And I think you are both started your academic training in the 1960s. And my first question, and I think a question that the audience will be very much interested in as well, is what were your first impressions of philosophy of science in the 1960s when you started in academia? And okay, so maybe we first go to Paul, and you can tell us a bit about how you got to philosophy of science in the 60s?
Yes, thank you. Also, I like the project very much. I think it's important. Well, I saw today, during the day, what an outsider I've been in philosophy of science, at least until 1993. Then, of course, my life changed completely. When I started studying in Munich, 1966, I started doing physics. But I had the firm plan, I want to do physics and afterwards philosophy. And at some time I thought, well, when I'm 30, I will have both doctorates, which was a little overambitious. At least I had one doctorate, namely in physics. So my plan was to do physics as fast as possible and then leave physics either after the master or after the doctorate and then switch to philosophy. So I switched, in fact, 1975, I finished my PhD in theoretical physics, and then I switched to philosophy due to fortunate circumstances. My first contact, so that was the plan from the very beginning. When I was 19 or 20, I decided I study physics, then I study philosophy. I want to become a philosophy professor for philosophy of science. So my first contact with philosophy of science was after encounters with, in Germany, 60s, continental philosophy of science in the Volkshochschule, these public universities, and there were strange people in retrospect, but I was impressed by them. Especially one Shishkov, he could talk a full hour without a manuscript in perfect sentences. I was deeply impressed. Anyway, so I went to the university and I went also to strange people. And then a classmate of mine, also a physicist, he said, there are some philosophers, namely Stegmüller. And I discovered Stegmüller in '67. So I went to Stegmüller then and I was impressed. And the wonderful thing was I immediately understood everything. At high school, I went to a class on Schelling, on the concept of freedom. I didn't understand anything. And then, so I went there, and I thought, oh, I understand everything. So I went to a logic class. I mean, I didn't have logic, but, I was mathematically not completely ungifted, and I understood everything immediately, and could answer questions quicker than others. I thought, that's wonderful. Philosophy, and I understand everything. And then the way Stegmüller presented it was just that he was just incorporated rationality. This is just rationality. This is what, of course, what I wanted. I wanted to be undogmatic. While my way into philosophy earlier was, I read at age 15, Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. And that was, and ever since, I've been no Christian. And for me, that was the first, the discussions of Christianity and the arguments against and pro theism and atheism and so on. And then I went this way, and I was deeply impressed by that. And then I learned, of course, Hampel's theory of explanation and all of that. And in physics, I was interested, at least from my master thesis on the question of time, namely the asymmetry of time. More specifically, why is there a difference between past and future? Right? And I wanted, which is a wonderfully philosophical question, and I wanted to approach that question in physics. So I wrote my master's thesis on the Wheeler-Feynman theory on electrodynamics, which is a theory that tries to explain what normally in physics is not explained but taken for granted. There's a difference between past and future in electrodynamics. Mainly, roughly speaking, we are seeing outgoing waves and very, very few collapsing waves. And there's an asymmetry, and the problem is, and that's a fundamental problem in physics until today, the Maxwell's equations are time symmetric, right? And the phenomena are time asymmetric, and the question is, how can we understand that? So I started this problem, and then I wrote, I had enough studied with Stegmüller, Hampel, theory of explanation, causal explanation, and then I thought, oh, I write a chapter in my diploma thesis in physics that we need a time-symmetric theory of causality. right? Because the causality theory is at time asymmetric, that we have. The antecedent conditions have to be earlier than the explanandum. And then I thought, if I want to apply that for the Wheeler-Feynman theory, we got to generalize that, and I did that in my diploma thesis. And I still remember one thing that must have happened 1970 that was a shock that really is still present. Namely, I wrote the sentence in the context then of having discussed philosophy of science. I wrote the sentence, and we see that the philosophy of science is in accordance to the practice of physics, to which my supervisor said, you gotta insert the word here, which was a complete shock, because for me it was clear that the philosophy of science is saying true things about physics. And by him insisting that I should insert the word here, I saw immediately, wait a minute, I shouldn't take that for granted. And that was a real shock. Because in physics, when you study physics or mathematics, you take everything for granted that the professors say. And if there's a mistake, you can tell him, professor, here's a mistake. And then, oh, I'm sorry, yes, a mistake. So you always only got the truth. And that was, for me, quite shocking that I saw, wait a minute, there may be a distance between philosophy of science and science. Anyway, then I finished, well, that was my first contact.
So maybe as a follow-up for both of you, you've described how you got interested in philosophy, but did you? What was your how was the aim of philosophy of science introduced to you? What was philosophy of science supposed to do according to your teachers, for instance, at Princeton or in Munich? Do you remember how they introduced it to you?
Yes. Well, the question was, what was the goal of philosophy of science when I was introduced to it? And that was in the State Middle School. That was very simple, rational reconstruction, right? And he wrote in '69 this book, 1,000 pages, in which he, condensed all the history of analytic philosophy, philosophy of science about explanation, and that sounded quite reasonable to me. And rational reconstruction, yes, if physicists speak about explanation, they say something, and then yes, I understand that as a philosopher, you want to rationally reconstruct that. And I was really a fan and had the feeling, this is real philosophy, I understand it, it's not that difficult that I thought. And what I also learned was that, continental philosophy was really awful. I mean, the first sentence in this big Stegmiller book on page 1 really is a sentence, if you read it, it's absolutely unnecessary, but he just says, Hegel hated logic or thought it was unnecessary. And then comes not really a quote. Well, the fact is, this was fabricated. What he says about Hegel is really absolutely fabricated. And I'm looking back at my education, education in scare quotes, with Stegmiller is really, it was brainwashing. I wasn't educated, I was brainwashed. And even on page 3, you find a logical mistake, in the introductory chapter, an introduction to logics. So I was not really pleased, but as I said, I didn't realize it when I was with Stegmiller, but then, I went to England, to Imperial College, and continued my PhD, or started my PhD in physics, and then I got an offer to go to Switzerland, to Zurich, continue my PhD, and then was something, then I finished the PhD in '75, and then I had the chance to switch to philosophy, so my life plan seemed to go the right way, and then something extremely strange happened, because they had a research center on Hegel there. So I expected to find a lot of idiots, right? To find really people, who were saying, and I wouldn't understand them. And much to my surprise, I found people, some of them were really clever, really intelligent, and they could argue with me that I really got in trouble. And they could also show me, Paul, you are unable to read a classical philosophical text because you've never learned that. Well, I was a physics PhD, theoretical physics. I thought I was a clever guy. I thought, of course I can read. But then I saw when they showed me how to read a difficult text by Kant or Fichte or Hegel or Jacobi, well, I couldn't do it. And I couldn't simply say, well, they're idiots just giving me bullshit. And that led me on a journey of something like 5 years that I got educated in continental philosophy. So I don't belong neither to analytic philosophy nor to continental philosophy. I know both worlds. And by the way, both worlds are equally dogmatic. Both worlds, really. Analytic philosophy is as narrow-minded partly and dogmatic as is continental philosophy, narrow-minded and dogmatic. So for instance, in continental philosophy in Zurich, it was absolutely clear that when you are a realist, right, a scientific realist or whatever sort of realist, you haven't entered philosophy yet. Because you have to understand that realism, common sense realism or scientific realism is just a philosophical. You haven't entered philosophy yet, and you've got to read some Kant and Schelling and Fichte and Hegel, and then you see that there are very different perspectives, right? And realism wasn't a topic of discussion. And of course, very few of the continental philosophers read Carnap about Stegmüller. Stegmüller, you don't read that. On the other hand, I mean, the continental philosophers, they didn't read Carnap. They thought that's all nonsense, right? It's all superficial in the best case, right? So, for instance, Patzig, who was a relatively famous analytic philosopher, and his father was a captain, and he wanted in the Navy, and he wanted also to be a Kapitän in the Navy. Unfortunately, the Navy didn't exist when he started studying in 1945. And then colleagues from him said, yeah, if you want to be a captain, why do you only sail so near to the shore? Why don't you go out to deeper waters? Meaning, you know, confronting the problems that Kant and Hegel and these people confronted. So they're really very narrow-minded, and that led me then, by the 1980s or so, that I took distance, you know, to all these philosophical schools. And for me, philosophical schools, to put it, well, I put it sometimes that way, you will like that possibly. If you join a philosophical school, you're losing 10 IQ points. And I don't have enough IQ points that I can just lose 10 IQ points, so I don't join a school. And you know, when I was at University of Constance, there were the German constructivists, and I could see it in action. I mean, when it came to defending their beloved school, they became, you know, they lost 10 IQ points. They were just so biased. You know, they couldn't see what strong evidence against them would count, and they played it down. So for me, well, I'd be so radical and say philosophical schools are unphilosophical, because that brings you to not questioning things and assumptions in an unbiased way. You become biased if you want to defend something. So I stopped defending philosophical position that they, you know, in the sense they are my property, you know. When people say, oh, I'm so proud to be an analytic philosopher. Well, it's your life, not mine, but I'm not proud. I'm proud to be a philosopher, that I can live on that, you know, meritocratically. I didn't cheat, I just achieved it with much luck, but I'm not proud of being, well, I am not anything, so.
So maybe, do you want to add something to this?
Well, the attitude, what philosophy of science should do to the sciences, is something where I can see, you know, I've got my primary socialization in science, so I was for 10 years in physics. And I can speak to scientists, and that shaped my whole philosophical career. So I almost never actively from my side started the conversation with the scientists, but I always waited until I was invited. So, and also in teaching. So when I started teaching in 1976 at the University of Zurich, then philosophy of science, that class was mandatory for the sociology students. So I tried to get examples then from sociology. And then later, I had a private discussion group with biologists, because one of the students at my class in general philosophy of science was a biology student. She later became a famous professor at MIT at Cambridge, and she said, hey, you are talking about concept change. Does that hold for the concept of gene as well? And then I thought, I don't know. And then we founded a philosophy of biology group, to which then 10 people from the faculty, doctoral students and assistant professors, full professors from the biology department then came to this private group, and then we had the plan, because one was especially interested, that we founded philosophy of biology for the biology students as a class that I gave there. And many other examples, so with geographers. So I had really the luck in my career that I was again and again approached by scientists of very different disciplines, either to cooperate with them on a scientific basis or to teach. So also the historians in University of Zurich approached me and said, hey, you've got an education as a theoretical physicist and you are an assistant to a philosopher of history. We want to exploit that, right? Why don't you give a class on the philosophy of historiography to our history students? And I had many such things. So I taught international horticulture students. I taught philosophy, psychology students in Constance. And now for the last 10 years, I've been teaching economic students, because a former student of mine became a professor of neuroeconomics, and well, this was the path. And so former students you've taught well, very good capital for you, really good capital, because they may invite you then in their disciplines to give a talk in the seminar, or they have other goodies for you. So some of them were very helpful. And last meeting with at the Christmas dinner for the economists, left to me was a retired professor, right to me was a retired economics professor. Both were my students, back in 19 whatever. So that's worth it, and I've got, of course, a very different approach, and of course it impresses most scientists if you say, well, I've got a physics degree. Usually when people ask me, what are you doing? Then I say, well, I'm a philosopher, but I've got a serious education. I've got a PhD in theoretical physics, right? And many people don't like that much, but some people do it, and I only use it when it's hopefully useful. So for me, that interaction with the sciences have been an integral part of my life. It's not that I only do philosophy for the scientists, but I like it when they ask me. So I had always had a constant battle with Feyerabend about that. Feyerabend said philosophy of science is only useful if it's useful for the sciences. And I say, no, that's not right. Philosophy of science is a part of culture in which we try to understand the most important factor, at least for the last 100 years and plus, the most important factor in our life, that is science. It's a part of culture to understand what we human beings are doing on this planet, right? We gotta understand the most important product of our culture, which is science. And that's a contribution to science, to culture, to science, and our general understanding. And this is also what I teach my students, You don't fund fundamental basic research now for the science side, only because potentially there will be technological applications. No, we want to understand the cosmos, we want to understand the stars, we want to understand the other living creatures, and this is what science does. It's a part of culture, and philosophy of science is just the most reflective one of this part of culture.
Okay, I would like to open up the floor. So if anyone would like to ask questions to Paul or Philip, please do so now. I will.
Thank you for the talk. So the last thing that you just said, that seems like a political statement about the role of science in society. And I'd just like to hear you say a little bit more about that we should fund the sciences to learn things about the natural world and its processes that some democratic citizens may not necessarily care about. And those citizens are, in turn, funding the science. So that strikes me as like a perfectionist value as opposed to, a shared value among pluralistic citizens. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there are other things what people don't share is opera, visiting the opera. I know in Switzerland, the seat is subsidized by $150 per seat, right? Other people's like beautiful gardens in the city. Right? And they love the flowers. That's also part of culture. So we have many, many, many different parts of culture, and not everyone loves everything. But if you live in a democratic and more pluralistic society, then it's probably one of the jobs of the government to support culture in its different forms. not only opera, but also, well, whoever the pop stars are at the moment, and all different kinds I was thinking about Madonna, but thanks God I didn't say the Beatles, right? Which would have been, so to speak, my next association. Anyway, but Taylor Swift doesn't need really support, does she? She earns the money herself. Finally, the name came back, yeah. Anyway, so this is absolutely right, but culture is just a multitude of attitudes. Many, many, many different things, and the question that has to be decided in the democracy, first of all, how much money goes into culture, from public sources, and what's the mix exactly? How much ballet you want to have, how much opera, how much Taylor Swift, and so on and so forth. And that's difficult, and this is the process of negotiation that in democratic societies will then be decided by the parliaments and by a democratic process. But the point is just to not to have only this utilitaristic perspective, on science, as is mostly in Parliament when it's discussed, at least I saw it in Switzerland and in Germany, and I was once in a situation in which I could influence the people, from there, and I said, don't argue for basic science only by its utilitaristic use. Press the point, it's part of culture. In the same way you have cities and you have a garden, and that's paid by public money. It's a part of culture, right? And not only by the utilitaristic things, but really by those things which we enjoy, and different people enjoy different things, and life is not just eating and drinking and having a shelter and having children, but it's also culture. And science and philosophy of science is part of that.
Okay, we have one final question here in the back.
Super. I mean, this dovetails very nicely to what you just said. I mean, maybe I can ask both of you, what are you most excited about right now in philosophy of science generally? What do you think that if you were a graduate student, you would be very excited to work on? What's the most exciting thing right now according to you, instead of looking back at your career, currently that you're super excited about in philosophy of science? What's the optimistic streak right now? Yeah.
Very short.
Well, I will answer on an entirely personal level. I want to finish that paper that I've already submitted to Philosophy of Science. It was rejected. Then I submitted it to the British Journal of Philosophy of Science. It was rejected. And now I'm writing the third or fifth version. And it's about the question, how do the abstract, robust models in economics explain?
Okay, on this note, let's take
So that was great. Thanks again, Philip, Paul, and Fons. That concludes our first day.